now. So I'm just going to introduce the styles, introduce Sylvia, and then we can get into it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first session of our September workshop. This was, it was a last minute thing, not very last minute, but it was like, it's not last minute at all. This was a replacement for what I usually do every month, gathering opportunities across Africa for mini makers across industries, across the arts, humanities, healthcare, environmental studies, industries, just to let people know the kinds of opportunities that are out there for us, and also to plug people to other organizations I think are doing very interesting, fantastic work on the continent. But last month I took a holiday and to recalibrate, so I wasn't able to set up an opportunities newsletter for this month. But I thought that actually even better is to bring people together to run these workshops, so to share their experiences. And our very first one, I'm very honored to have Sylvia Arthur. I also never know how to pronounce this surname. Arthur. There was the cartoon character, right? I just didn't know how to say his name. But she's the founder of the Library of Africa and the Africa Diaspora, which I was a resident in, I was part of the writing residency in 2022. And it helped me in ways that I cannot even describe. I made my film there. I got to meet people there. It was also one of my first it was my first time in LOATAD, but it was also my first time being in an African cultural institution in person that I was very impressed by, and I was in awe of. I still deep respect for Sylvia and Seth and everyone who works with and in the organization. So yeah, in summary, that's why I do, that's who Sylvia is. But you get to learn more about LOTAAD now. Sylvia, on to you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Immaculata for inviting me to be part of this series. I also am honored. And as she said, my name is Sylvia Arthur. I'm the founder of the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, or LOTAAD for short, in Accra, Ghana. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about how to build a cultural institution in particular. And so to begin with, I'd like to just play 2 minutes of this video that was made as part of an exhibition that's taking place, or it's just come down in Zurich in Switzerland, which is about literary institutions in Africa. And it focuses on two in particular. One of them is LOTAAD and the other one is 1949 books in Côte d'Ivoire. So for those of you who may not know about us, I'm just going to play 2 minutes of this video. So let me do something. My name is Sylvia Arthur. I'm the founder of the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora here in Accra, Ghana. LOTAAD has 3 pillars on which it's based. They are knowledge production, knowledge preservation, and knowledge dissemination. In terms of the first, knowledge production, what we're very keen to establish is the fact that Africa is known as a knowledge consumer, but we have been producers of knowledge for centuries. And that is one of the main missions of the library, to show that, both through our collection, our main collection, and our archive as well. And then we also do our own knowledge production work in-house. And so we have a women's oral archive, for example, that we have gone out and gathered the stories of Ghanaian women. And we've also done pieces of work on African futurism and an African children's literature curriculum. So that's the knowledge production work. In terms of knowledge preservation, that's the archive that we have. And we have an extensive archive that includes a number of first editions and rare and out-of-print books from across Africa and the diaspora, but also lots of ephemera in terms of letters and photographs and, other bits and pieces from a writer's archive as well. In terms of knowledge dissemination, that is the library itself and the main collection. The Library of Africa and the African Diaspora began in 2017 as Libraria Ghana in a one-room office in West Legon, which is a suburb of Accra. It started with my own collection, and I am an individual collector. And so what I do is I travel around to antiquarian bookstores and to booksellers, not only in in Europe, but also in the Americas and Africa, and I go in search of this material. So it's partly doing detective work. They don't exist all in one place. Africans have always traveled outside in order to do their work, and especially so with literature.
Okay, so as you got an idea from there, the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora is a library, it's a writing residency, and it's a literature institute or literary institute based in Accra, Ghana. And I would like to talk today about building a cultural institution using LOATAD, obviously, as an example of how to do that. And I've come up with 5 steps and a bonus for building a cultural institution in Africa. I actually could come up with about 20 or 25, but this is the condensed version for this workshop. So the first thing that I would say is to start small. So as I said in the video, I started what was then called Libraria Ghana in 2017 in a one-room office in a suburb of Accra, using 1,300 of my own books, but with about 10 to 15,000 US dollars of my own money in startup costs. And these costs don't include the cost of the books themselves, which I'd been collecting over many, many years previously, but they did count for the rent, the shop well, not the shop fittings, but the furniture fittings, the shelves, the furniture desks, chairs, you know, shipping, all that kind of stuff, because a lot of stuff I brought over from Europe. But within 2 years, we'd outgrown that space. So this is the first space. This is the one-room office in West Legon in a suburb of Accra. And it was literally just a tiny room. It was a small room, but I think we managed to pack a lot and to do a lot in that small room. But within 2 years, and I would even say well before 2 years, within about 6 months, we'd quickly outgrown that space. And so after 2 years, because I signed a 2-year contract for the office, and I'm sure maybe in Nigeria it's the same, you have to pay the rent in advance and 2 years in advance. So I paid for this space for 2 years in advance. We outgrew it within 6 months, but we stayed for the 2 years. And after the 2 years, we moved into a 5-bedroom house, which has a garage, or it had a garage that we turned into an exhibition space and a screening room. And it also had a spacious back garden that we used as an event space. I should say that that was in 2020, which was obviously the beginning of COVID. So that was a bit of a nightmare, because I just paid 2 years of rent in a place that was charging US dollars and a lot of US dollars, because as I said, it was a 5-bedroom house in a very nice suburb. But, you know, that's a different story that I'll move on to slightly later. But that was the second space. But for the last 3 years, we moved again. We moved again 3 years ago, and we've been in a 2-story, 7-room house. It's a 5-bedroom main house, and then it's got a 2-bedroom outhouse. And we are further away from the center of Accra now, and that is intentional. A lot of people ask why we are not based in Osu or Laboni, which are the more kind of central and affluent areas. But we are intentionally not in those places, and ideally, we would move even out of Accra altogether. But I never anticipated that we would grow to this extent, or that we would grow so fast. But it quickly became clear that we had filled a need in the literary and cultural space in Accra, and not just in Accra, but in the wider African diaspora as well. I think what we did was we tapped into a desire that was latent in people across the continent, and also across the diaspora, for highlighting, preserving and disseminating and celebrating African and diaspora literature. And not just that, but bringing African and diaspora literature together in such a visible and intentional way. So I would say start small, but you know, whatever you do, just start. I think that's the most important thing. Don't wait for anybody else. Don't wait for funding. Don't wait for anything. If it's possible, just start with what you've got and where you are. The second thing I would say is to know your mission and your purpose, or in other words, to be intentional, and where possible, to build a brand and to build a movement. My intention when starting the library was simple. It was to give people in Accra access to contemporary, culturally relevant, and what I consider to be really good literature, both through the library and through a program of innovative, creative literary events. I wanted to put African and diaspora literature on par with what is considered the global canon. Beyond that, I had no real plan. But the murder of George Floyd in the United States in 2020 and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests, which were global, catalyzed interest in the library in a way that I could not have anticipated. Suddenly, the international media was interested in us, from the BBC and Al Jazeera to France 24, all wanting to know what the alternatives were like for Black people in the diaspora looking to Africa as home and as a refuge away from the racism of their daily lives in the West. By that time, we were already gathering momentum. We changed our name from Libraria Ghana to the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora in 2020, before the murder of George Floyd, to better encapsulate who we are and what we stand for. And we'd nurtured a diverse and dedicated following online, specifically through our Instagram page, where our followers were from all over the continent and the world. However, the media attention magnified that tenfold. Suddenly, we were receiving small donations from people in the United States in particular and Europe, and not just money, but they were also sending us books, African books, Black books, and we became a movement. And that was the best thing that happened. The fact that my idea of a small library resonated with so many people, because as the saying goes, the personal is political, and having a Black library in a Black country that has historically meant so much to the Black diaspora was and is a radical act. That said, it wasn't really the BBC and the international media whose audiences reacted to us in such a positive way. I can pinpoint an interview I did with the Ghanaian YouTuber Wadimaya in 2020, and that really generated like a ton of feedback and small donations. And I think the kind of lesson of that is know your community, know who your people are, and not just tap into the zeitgeist, but I guess be the zeitgeist would be the best thing to say. So this is a picture, and most of the pictures, and I haven't used many, but most of the pictures in this presentation are from the first library, the one that opened in 2017, so that first office space. So the third thing is to diversify your funding and your revenue streams. In the last 3 years, we've received funding from the European Union, the African Union, Africa No Filter, Hawthornden Foundation, among various others. But I think this is the important thing. I invested tens of thousands of my own British pounds before anyone ever gave me $1. Why would someone put their money into something you're not prepared to put your own money into? Also, I think another key thing here is that organizations hardly ever fund ideas, they fund realities. So to reiterate point 1, start small, but start. It shows commitment, which makes funders feel like there is less risk associated with funding you. And the longer you exist, the more willing they are to take you seriously. Number 4 is keep records. Register your company or organization. Keep accounts, get them audited, and do this from the start or well before you need to do that. And let me give you an example. We applied for funding, and I'm going to say it was for $10,000 US, but it wasn't. But we applied for funding for $10,000 from a philanthropic organization. We submitted a detailed application. They had an application form. We filled it in comprehensively. We were invited for an interview. And after several weeks of nervous waiting, we were told that we'd got through to the next stage. However, because they wanted to give grants to as many organizations as possible, they offered us a grant of $5,000 US instead of the $10,000 that we applied for. We were disappointed, but we persevered and we proceeded to the next stage. They asked us to submit our paperwork, which included company registration certificates, audited accounts, annual reports, and other official documents. We sent everything they asked for by the deadline. Several weeks later, when we received the contract to sign, I was shocked to discover that we'd been given the original $10,000 US that we applied for. So now I have a question for you, the audience here. Can anyone guess why? feel free to answer, like to come off mute and answer, or to type it in the chat.
I think they went through the records, and then they were convinced that these people actually have, track of what they've already done, and this is actually what they will use this funding to do.
Thank you. You're kind of correct, but there is more. Somebody said you were able, exactly, is Dupe, maybe someone else didn't have the paperwork. That's exactly it. It's because many of the other organizations that they were hoping to fund were without the correct paperwork. So in the end, even though they had been awarded the funding in theory, in practice, they disqualified themselves by not having their documentation in order. So there was more money in the pot. And as I'm sure you all know, that with these funding organizations, they have to spend the money before the end of the financial year, otherwise it gets taken back. So, I was really shocked actually to receive this contract and see that we had been given the original money that we'd applied for. But the reason why was because we had all our documentation in order, and many other organizations didn't. They couldn't prove their company structure. They couldn't prove their banking and all that kind of stuff. They had no audited accounts. And I think this is particularly important for African organizations, which I'll kind of come on to slightly later. So this leads me on to point number 5, which is to document everything. I began documenting the creation of the library before it even opened. As soon as I signed the lease on the one-room office space in 2017, I took photos of the empty space, of the journey of bringing the books down from Kumasi, which is where most of them were in my mum's house, to Accra, which is where the library is, of sorting through the books, arranging and cataloguing the books, of fitting out the space with the shelving and the furniture, and decorating it with what we became known for, which is the wall-to-wall pictures of writers from across Africa and the diaspora across generations. I posted these images daily on our social media accounts, and people began to have a stake in the realization of the project. They were commenting, asking questions, making suggestions, and getting actively involved. And once we got off the ground, we began working with great photographers who are present at all our events and every new library opening, because we have 3 school and community libraries in addition to the main one. And they made professional photos of all our activities, and that really set us apart. So to reinforce the previous point, which was about keeping official records, the kind of photographic records and the video recording, and all this kind of stuff, it's really essential, because many donors are nervous about giving funds to African organizations in particular. By showing your work and what you're already doing, you'll provide reassurance that you're legit, and they will get an insight into the community and the audiences that they'll be supporting as well. So yeah, records in terms of documentation, it applies to both, the kind of official documentation in terms of company registration, but also documentation of the work that you do. And finally, my bonus point. Oh, and yeah, so here's an image from, this is the the Caribbean American poet, Arsha Monet, who came to do a workshop at the library. This was the second library here in 2021, I think it was. And we have, like I said, images and documentation and video and audio of everything that we've done practically from 2017 up until the present day. So my final kind of point is to be consistent. I started thinking about the library around 2010 or 2011. At the time, I was living and working in Brussels, Belgium, and I was collecting books. That's where most of the books were collected. But I didn't open it until 2017. So that's a whole 6 or 7 years later. And I didn't get any funding for it until 2021 or 22. So that's a whole, 5 years later that I was self-funding it, and I continue to for the most part as well. But yet from the day that we opened our doors 7 years ago, we've been consistent with who we are, with what we do, with what we believe, what our mission is, and with our engagement and interaction with our social media following. So the best thing you can do for your image, your reputation, and your brand is to be consistent. And don't be afraid to change things up or to even quit. There's no shame in quitting. At the end of the day, everything is a lesson, even if we don't see it as such at the time. So that's us today. And I say thank you for listening. Immaculata, I know you wanted me to talk about tips for applying for the residency, but do you want me to do that now, or should we do?
Thank you. Oh, there's so many questions that your presentation that brought up from me. Maybe we can go into the residency one immediately, so we can take that out, and then the rest of the Q&A will be on like the building of LOTAAD. How does that sound?
Okay. So with the residency, we ran the first residency, I think, in 2022. And that was the West African Writers Residency, for which we received funding from the European Union, the ACP EU. I think for the first one, we had 12 places, and we received maybe 180 applications. For the second one, probably 200. And then we had the African Union Residency, for which we received about 400. And then we have the current LOTAAD Black Atlantic Residency. The first year of that, we received 442 applications. And so obviously every year it's grown. And what I would say is, having read through lots of applications now, what I would say is that when people are assessing applications, they're really looking for reasons to disqualify you, not to take you. And that is the most important thing that you should bear in mind. So if we have asked you, and I think what you need to do is put yourself in the shoes of the people who are reading through those applications. You have 500 applications. If somebody has not given you what you've asked for in any way possible, you are very happy to dismiss them, because it means that you can move on to the real thing, basically. So what I would say is respond to the specific theme if the residency has one. Saying you need time and space is neither necessary nor sufficient to qualify for a writing residency anywhere. Saying you want to work on the novel you've been dying to complete when the purpose of the residency is to explore the Black Atlantic, for example, is a no-no. If the residency is themed, state how you and your work will contribute to and benefit from being in a space devoted to exploring that theme, and also explain why now. Another point I would say is that show that you have an interest in the library and its mission, and not just the residency. Obviously, we get lots of applications from people, and it's very clear as soon as you read the application that they have no idea what the library is, what it's about, what we do, and they just apply because it's something to apply for. And that will immediately turn off somebody who's reading the application, because you could go and do a residency anywhere in theory, but why do you want to come to us in particular? Another point, if we request something, please provide it. As I said, when you receive so many applications, you're looking for applicants who can show that they've at least bothered to read through the criteria, even if they don't fully meet it. So for example, at the time of the African Union residency, they required us to ask for the passport page of everybody who was applying, which is something that we hadn't done before. And obviously there is a reason for asking for this passport page. You are going to travel from wherever you are to Ghana to be in residence. And if you don't have that, fine, you can write to us and say, I don't have a passport at the moment, but don't think that you can just bypass that, because we're asking for a reason. And the same thing with the references as well. We ask for 2 references, and they will only be contacted if you are successfully shortlisted. So please provide those. And like we also say, can you tell us your relationship to the referee? Like loads of people do not explain who their referee is. And like I said, if you're looking for some reason to disqualify somebody, something as small as that could lead to a disqualification. And then finally, I would say the deadline is the deadline. Honestly, with the first Black Atlantic residency, like I said, we received 442 applications, but actually in total, we received about 512, with about 60 being after the deadline. And people come and they'll say, oh, but you said it was 11:59 and it was 11:59. It's 11:59 GMT. And if you can't even, like I said, if you can't even work out what GMT time is in your country, and then you write to us and say, oh, but I missed the deadline, I thought it was 11:59 EST or BST or whatever. No, it's not good enough. you are claiming or purporting to be a writer, I would say something fundamental to being a writer is reading. So, you know, that's just that. And that's it. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. Please, everyone, allow me to send in my questions first. Organizer privileges. My questions are, they're kind of, anyway, they're by the side. So like, for example, when you said it's important to share why the institution, I just, because sometimes, first of all, I'm a very like, oh, I need time and space girl, which obviously has not been getting me the residencies. But when you say why the institution, is it enough to say like, with someone like something like LOTAAD, you guys are one of the only people doing this in West Africa. Is it enough to say, oh, you're the only one I can see around?
Yeah, I would say yes. You know, I think some people, they try to be maybe clever or cocky. And like, I remember one application, you know, there was a stipend attached to it. And the first thing they said is, you know, I really need the money. And you just think to yourself, well, get a job or do something. Do you know what I mean? So yes, you can say you're the only people doing this, but I think it also requires a bit of deeper thinking. And I can give an example. So I've done about 4 residencies in my life. One of them is at Hedgebrook in Washington State, which is an all-women's residency. And I think like when I was applying to that, what was I thinking to myself? I was thinking, wow, this is a space where it's going to be only women. You don't have that pressure of, you know, that kind of male gaze type of pressure thing. As women, obviously, we have certain things in common. It would be nice to be able to share your thoughts and your work with, you know, your own gender, you know, whatever. You can come up with loads of things that are specific to that particular institution that don't include, I just want to go to Accra, or I love Ghana. You know, we get this as well. You know, I've never been to Ghana. I really want to come. I have lots of friends in Accra, because that just signals to me that you're not going to be in the residency. You're going to be in Osu and Laboni and all these places when you should be in the residency writing. So in answer to your question, yes, you could say we're the only people doing this, but rather than saying that, why is it important to you to come to this place at this time? And yeah.
Well, I'm learning because I've definitely written, oh, I just need the money right now.
We all need the money. We all need the money, but you know.
Yeah. Now I'm not sure. Well, I have another question, but as I ask this question, if you have questions, drop in the chat box. I know people already sent in their questions, so I'll put maybe 5 of those questions after my last question. But this other question has to do with the building of the cultural institution. And for me, it's a question of team building. Like, how have you gone around, and like, what are best practices you've seen from other people building institutions at your level to actually get the talent that you need at the like level of commitment that you and your institution needs, but also to compensate them? Because sometimes when you're at that stage of like funding everything on your own, you're not even feeling yourself, like you're using your money from wherever you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I have a job. You know, I've had a job all these years that is paying for the library. But thank you for the question, because that was another thing that I had down, but I had to edit it down, which is about building a team. And actually what I would say to that is the right people will find you. And I know that's probably not the best response, but it's what's true in terms of what's happened with LOTAAD. So for example, Seth, who's the manager of the physical space in Accra, Ghana, I first met him before the library opened through the posting that I was doing on Instagram. As I said, I was posting, you know, when it was an empty shop and how it was being built. And he started to follow the page and we interacted on the page, and he came to the opening event. And yeah, for many, I mean, he had a job. He was working, doing another job. And I think he joined full time probably about 3 years ago. Prior to that, it's been a lot of interns who've come through. And like I said, they came to us. I didn't go to them. So I remember like one time we had an event, I can't remember what it was exactly, but then somebody came up to me and said, you know, I'm from the University of Ghana. I've just finished my master's, so I have, you know, some months that are free, and I would really like to work at the library. She ended up being there for 1.5 years, and she's now in the United States doing a PhD. I think it's important that when you have such a kind of high turnover of people, whether it's interns or paid people, from my perspective, I actually, especially if you're a student, it's not that I don't really want you to stay. I want you to go on and to achieve your potential. And what you bring to the library, obviously, I hope we bring something to you as well, and you go off and you use it. But most people have come to us, and it's been, you know, something I always say is that I'm the face of the library, but I'm definitely not the library. There are many, many people who have contributed to the success, if you would call it that, of this particular institution. And if I were to name them, you know, I could probably say about 20 people, you know, really. And of those 20 people, a core of about 6 or 7. So let me name them very quickly off the top of my head. Obviously, number 1 is Seth Avasuglo, who is the library manager and who runs it, the physical space. Obviously, Nipa Dennis, the photographer, who has been photographing and videoing and doing all this kind of stuff for us as well. Who else is there? Fauzia, who is now in the United States. Roxanne. Yeah, Kai Kirsten, who was a, you know, student from Switzerland, actually, who was doing a year study at the University of Ghana. And he had to do like, you know, some kind of credit where he goes out and works for an institution. And so he came to work for us for 1 year. Nora Adu, Elizabeth Johnson, you know, just so many people, so many people.
Thank you. Let's get into questions already. And actually, I think I'll just go with the questions in the chat box. Kamsi had, relating to the building of culture of a cultural institution, can you speak a bit more about the starting small aspect? Did you leave your job eventually to focus on the library full-time? And at what point did you do that? And how were you managing a full-time job and running the library as well in the early years? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so I left, so I mean, maybe you can tell from my voice, I'm born in the UK, raised in the UK, but of Ghanaian heritage, obviously. And I was actually working, as I said, in Brussels, Belgium, between 2010 and 2012, physically based in Brussels, working with the European institutions. And I left to be a consultant in 2013. And the beauty of being a consultant is that it obviously affords you certain flexibility. To give you kind of context, when the UK decided to leave the European Union in 2017, I thought, okay, well, now's a good time for me to go to Ghana. And so that's when I moved to Ghana in 2017. And so by that time, I had some savings, I would say, but I was also working as a consultant and doing that. And without that, I definitely would not have been able to not only open the library, but to continue to run it consistently for the last 7 years. Because one thing I should say about the funding is that funding tends to be project-based. It's not operational funding. And that is a very difficult position to always be in, because it's like you always have to have or start or conceive of a project just so that you can apply for specific funding. But then what happens when that project is over? Obviously, I still employ people. I still have a library manager. I still have cleaners. I still have, you know, various other people, and they have to be paid whether the project is running or not. And so, yes, I keep a job, and it's very difficult, but I would say for the first 2 years or 3 years, I wasn't really working much, and I was focusing full time on the library, for sure. I used to be in the library every day. This was before having, obviously, Seth, who's there now. And yeah, I think it's important to maintain a job, actually. I think it keeps you, you know, there's a saying that if you want something done, give it to a busy person. I think that is exactly it. And you know, I just think it keeps your brain engaged in a different way. And it obviously keeps the lights on. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Karen is asking, at what point do we need to register the organization, especially if it started as an art project? My question too.
Yeah, I would say do it as soon as possible, honestly, because it's one thing to register as an organization, as in the example that I gave, but they like to see that you have been in operation for a while, so that it's not that you're just registering the organization because you want to apply for this particular funding. And I can give you another example. We registered as a limited company. I'm very against the idea of NGOs in principle. And so I resisted for as long as possible registering as an NGO. And so we operated as a private company. But then, as I'm sure you all know, it's very difficult to get funding if you are not a registered nonprofit. And so, one of the other points I was going to make is about using your network. I had a friend who was on the board of a funding organization. I had no idea he was on the board of this funding organization. And then we got a letter inviting us to apply for funding, because this funding organization do not give grants out to people. You can't just apply for them. You have to be kind of nominated for them. And so, they said, you have been invited to apply for this funding, but you need to be a nonprofit. And I was like, well, we're a limited company. There's nothing I can do about it. But what we did was we registered the nonprofit there and then, practically. But because we had all the accounts and all the documentation from the limited company, it helped us with that. But otherwise, if you haven't got like 3 years experience of running a company or an organization or a nonprofit, most funders will not look at you. They won't look at a startup as such, because like I said, they fund reality, they don't fund ideas. So they want to see the evidence that you have been working for the last 3 years at least. So I would say register it as soon as possible, even if it means having to do the bare minimum. But if you can do more, do more, but yeah, register as soon as possible.
You have 2 follow-up questions on this NGO matter. One is, why don't you support NGOs? And 2 is, how do you decide where to register if you're based outside of the continent? Do you register in both countries?
Yeah, in terms of why I don't like NGOs, I guess it's a personal thing. I think Africa is I think NGOs have made Africa dependent on them. And unfortunately, what they'll do is they'll give you just enough, but not enough so that you can thrive, but enough so that you remain dependent and you have to keep on going back and say, oh, please give me some more, give me some more. And they'll give you more, but it will never be enough. So I think that's personally why I'm against NGOs. Unfortunately, and I think this is shown in places like Haiti and various other places, I think they do more damage than they do good sometimes. The question about registering the NGO, what was the question about if you're not based?
Yeah, if you're not based on the continent, how do you decide where to register? Like, would it be better or more advantageous to register your NGO in the UK versus in Ghana?
Yes. Okay. I mean, this is a really relevant question for us as well. So we are registered in Ghana completely. There is no NGO of LOATAD in the UK or in the USA. However, what I have been thinking about a lot lately, having met with various funders, is that it can be quite beneficial to also have the NGO registered in either the United States or the UK in order to enable you to access more funding. However, I really do think it's maybe disingenuous is too strong a word, but I do think it's disingenuous to have an organization that works solely in Africa, not registered in an African country. So I would say, if it's possible for you to at least register it in, whatever country that you're working in, but then also for kind of practical reasons to also register it in, whatever country you are abroad, whether it's the United States or the United Kingdom or, wherever. It will open up funding opportunities for you a lot more. Because as I said, I think it's the case that there is a lot of funding available for African institutions and organizations. From my experience, I found that people are very willing to fund and give grants to African organizations. However, they're worried and they're nervous So when they do encounter an organization that has all its documentation, is running well, is quite visible, then it's much easier for you to access the finance.
Yeah. I see that. And I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to put up, so I'm going to read out other people's questions on the chat right now. Anonyeche Onogun is asking, would LOTAD ever do a workshop catered to literary editors? Have seen very little of these, particularly from African literary organizations.
Yes, we would. I mean, I think we do. Our problem is not lack of ideas, it's lack of resources. And I don't even mean financial, which it always is, but I mean lack of human resources. It's something that we've thought about. You know, we have wanted to do in the past events for editors, like special focuses on things like nature writing, for example, you know, lots and lots of different things where we believe there is a need and an opportunity to kind of strengthen the ecosystem. But unfortunately, yes, it's just a case of resources, but yes, we would be open to doing that. So you can email us and maybe we can talk about it.
Miriam is asking a question about organizations, and I'm going to bunch her question with mine. She asks, hopefully she's a she, I don't know. Do you think we need more organizations or more involvement? And my question was, what do you see as the role of, the role or the potential for corporate cultural institutions, like, how can we, I don't know, what do you think about the prospect of cultural institutions that exist on a for-profit, not just by like way of the legal entity, but actually how it operates to sustain itself?
Yeah.
In a profit model.
Yeah, I'm definitely for, like I said, we started as a limited company, which is a for-profit, obviously, organization or entity. I definitely think that we need to diversify the kind of different setups of literary institutions and cultural institutions that exist on the continent, because the default is to be a non-profit. The first part of the question, I was going to say something about which, do we need more institutions? Yes, I think we need more institutions. I guess what the LOTAD experiment, if you would call it that, has shown is that, like I said, there is definitely not only a desire, but a need for more cultural institutions on the continent. And as you mentioned, you know, how many writing residencies exist, not even in West Africa, on the whole African continent, because I can only think of about 4. In reality, I think from the level of applications and the interest that we receive, not just from Africa, but from the diaspora as well, there is definitely a demand and an interest, but you have to start. And I was going to say something else. I was going to say that I also think that it helps that we have a physical premises as such, you know, because when you are applying for funding, like I said, lots of things exist on paper or exist virtually or exist in somebody's head. But when you have something that people can physically come to, and that's not just from a funding perspective, it's from a kind of cultural consumer perspective, I think it makes a huge difference. We definitely need more institutions. We need more individuals building these institutions, because we clearly can't rely on governments to do those kind of things. And it takes a lot of sacrifice, because, you know, I would say, you know, I mentioned in the beginning that I'd invested, you know, lots of British pounds or US dollars into this. It's not that I had those pounds or dollars, it's that I sacrificed to invest it. And yeah, I think we need more people doing that. And obviously we have lots of people, you know, doing that, especially in Ghana, which is what I know. You know, obviously you've got Ibrahim Mahama and Amwako Boafo, but, you know, these are people who have some money, but I don't think we should let that get in our way.
I wonder with this Miriam's question, and Miriam, please feel free to expand in the chat box, because she asked, do we think we need more organizations or more involvement? And I wonder how she's thinking of involvement as opposed to organizations. I guess that's something she can expand on, and then we can
maybe I can try to answer that. Yeah, I do think we need more involvement, because I tell you, like, I remember when I first opened the library in the first office space, obviously the events that we would do would have maybe, 2 people turn up or 3 people turn up. Even today, sometimes you'll be expecting 50 people and maybe 10 will turn up. So I definitely think we need more involvement from people. And, sometimes what we're good at is following and not really actioning that following, especially in the online culture. It's very easy to be passively following an organization or an institution, but when it actually comes to turning out for that organization and institution, it's a very different thing. So if that's what you mean by involvement, I agree with you.
Yeah, definitely. Hello. I was
Hi.
thinking about the fact that people don't actually show up, and I even think about this because I'm at college, university, and we have different organizations on campus for diaspora, for people to come, and it was a hard journey to convince university to allow us to give us the funding to organize event and all of that, but people don't show up, and we talk about all that they always ask about. We create spaces for people. We ask them to come. This is a lot of learning sometimes.
Yeah.
But like every time there is those type of events, people don't come, and it's getting to a point when it's like very upsetting. And I thought that maybe it was because it was at a university level, because I don't know, students or whatever. But like also hearing or seeing this happening with different organizations just outside of universities, also seeing the turnout being 2 people, 3 people. I don't know. It gets to be a bit like maybe this is not something that actually interests people, which is also so kind of concerning, because I feel like this is what we talk about every time when we talk about like the diaspora, this our group of people, what we want for each other, I don't know. I always feel like those are the type of conversation that rise up, but also when we ask people to actually be involved, it's another story.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I totally empathize, because I mean, even I think last month we had an event and like 1 person turned up. So, and we've been going for 7 years now. But then, the previous month we had an event and 45 people turned up. So I think it's about experimenting, and, speaking to people, speaking to your audience and finding out what it is they want to, what kind of events they want to come to. But also another thing I would add there is to say, especially when I first started the library, and I remember, the first month I sat there every day and nobody would come in, hardly, maybe 1 or 2 people. And after about 6 months, I decided that rather than sitting here and waiting for people to come to me, I would go out and meet the people where they are. And so we started doing events in markets, in schools, in different locations, just all around, not just Accra, but even further afield. So I think that's something to bear in mind too. Maybe you could also go out to where people are, rather than hoping that they will come to you.
That's such a huge one. And for me, like when I think of what I want to do with Studio Styles, that's my priority, because I feel like I'm slotting Studio Styles into this space of community engagement to like convince people why spaces like this are important and useful in their lives, but you have to go and meet them where they are already.
Yes.
Chika, please, you may unmute yourself. Hi.
Okay, thank you so much. If I may ask 2 questions. The first one is this registration in the US or the UK. I know in the American context, if you want to register in the US, an organization mostly do work in Africa and benefiting Africa.
Oh, I can't really hear you properly. The connection.
The US.
The connection is not stable. I can't really hear you properly.
It can actually flag the organization as money laundering. Because they're wondering why is this, based on this, but all the Yeah, I know it's so terrible. But I was just saying, registering in the US, an organization that's mostly benefiting. Yeah, I might just have to write down the question. I'll just write it. I'll just hide the question.
Okay.
And then have to type question.
Okay, type it.
Yes. Oh, okay.
No,
Okay.
still bad.
What I would say from what I've picked up of what you're saying is, yes, it's true.
I would say type the question. Yes, please. You can go ahead, Sylvia.
Yeah, I was going to say, from what I picked up of the question, what I would say is that one thing you could also do is to get a fiscal sponsor, which we have in the United States. So obviously, look, we, especially after all the international media interest, had lots of people from the United States, particularly African Americans, contacting us saying, I'd like to donate, and from the UK actually, saying, I'd like to donate, but, they're doing it as a tax write-off, obviously. And so you need to be a registered charity, and preferably a registered charity in whatever country they are from. And in order to get the funding from one particular organization, as I said, we registered as an NGO, but then we also got a fiscal sponsor in the United States, which means that they kind of act as your representative organization in the United States, so that if people want to donate to you, they can donate to that organization and then they give you the funding. So you don't need to register yourself as an NGO or a non-profit in the United States. So it's kind of like we would call it an umbrella scheme over here. So they kind of act as your representative. But again, you have to have all your paperwork in check in order to, in order to qualify to even get a fiscal sponsor. And so we had to go through a very, I'd say rigorous kind of vetting process.
Stuff is not beans. I've just included some questions from the form, the sign-up form. And one question here had like 20 octopus legs. So I'll just read them out, and whatever sticks to you, please grab. And what is the place of artists in African societies today? Are we social scientists? How can I develop the science of the social? How to balance the individual in the community? How do we heal as a community? What resources do we need for that? And what is my responsibility as a member of the diaspora for the healing of my people?
Wow. In terms of what is the place of artists in African societies, I would echo the great Nina Simone when she said that an artist's job is to reflect the times. I definitely think that. And even if you consider your own country right now and what the majority of people are going through economically, socially, culturally, so many things that are going on. I think if an artist's role is not to, in some way, not be the voice for, but to reflect that, then, what is an artist's role? I don't know. How to balance the individual and community. I think that is actually a difficult question that I do not have an answer for, because if I did, I probably would be doing things a lot differently. Unfortunately, and I hate the term passion project. I really, really hate it. I even hate the term project in relation to this library, because obviously the term project implies that it has a start date and an end date. And if you're trying to build an institution, you're trying to build something long lasting. But it is something that I'm passionate about. And because if you're passionate about something, it's very difficult to divorce the individual from the community, because you're always in it. You're always mentally in it. You're always sometimes physically in it. And maybe I can answer that question slightly this way. Like I said, I moved to Ghana in 2017, and I thought, yeah, I'm leaving the racism of the UK and of Europe behind, Brexit and all that kind of thing. And then it was about, when I left in June, and it was about 9 months later, there was the murder of the Brazilian politician Marielle Franco in Rio de Janeiro. She was assassinated as she was driving back from the meeting. And that really affected me in a big way, you know, in a way that you would think that I knew this woman. And that just showed me that you cannot, even if you remove yourself physically from a space, mentally, you're always still there. And so in terms of the diaspora, and what responsibility we have, I think we have a responsibility to each other as Africans, as diasporans, as human beings, as women, as men, as everything. And if your way of exercising that responsibility is by doing your art, then do it to your fullest extent. What is the future of African archives? How can we go about sharing knowledge in a collaborative way? I think this is a really great question. I think the future of African archives is lots of individuals working, as we see now, to try to retrieve and preserve and to store in the present those things which are important to us before they're taken away or before people can deny that they ever existed. And you can even see that in cases around the world at the moment, you know, different war situations where the culture is being destroyed. The literal physical artifacts are being destroyed intentionally because they know the significance of what that means to a people's identity and a people's purpose. So I think in terms of the future, I think it's actually bright, because I think a lot of people now are tuned into the fact that our cultural heritage is important, both tangible and intangible. And there are lots of people who are working in their own individual ways to preserve that culture. The challenge is how, and as you say in your question, is how do we combine efforts? And it's not that we combine efforts in terms of combining resources or all working on the same thing, but it's how do we support each other, I think is the question. And that's probably the big challenge.
It's 7. Oh, well, it's an hour, 7 my time. I don't know what time it is at yours. I don't know
7.
how long. Sorry?
I can answer a few more questions if there are some.
Okay. Also, whenever you're ready to leave, you can leave, and whoever wants to remain on the call, we can remain on the call and just like continue chatting till maybe, I don't know, 9 p.m. on my side. I'm down to chat. So check out.
That's for sure, I can do.
Okay. Chika had a couple follow-up questions, which are, why the fail funding Africans? Systemic racism. Does this mean that European/American/Asian social entrepreneurs are more trustworthy /accountable? And also, do you receive support from Ghanaian businesses? I think I'm very, very interested, especially in this second one. How are Ghanaians actually supporting you?
I mean, the short answer is no. No. And not just Ghanaian businesses, but Ghanaian media, no. You know, it's interesting when I was redoing the website and I had the logos of various, media institutions who had done a story on us. And one of my colleagues who I was working with said, don't you have any logos of Ghanaian media or African media? And unfortunately, no. Especially not Ghanaian, because we'd had like an interview with SABC, South African Broadcasting Corporation, but no. So the first part of the question, yes, I mean, unfortunately, we live in a world where Africans and Black people in general are always at the bottom, unfortunately. And there is a fear of funding African institutions because, you know, even if you think of, and I'm pretty convinced there's lots of Nigerians on this call, think of the image of Nigeria even outside of Nigeria. I mean, I don't know what it's like inside Nigeria because unfortunately I've never been, but outside of Nigeria. And if you think about that and you think about the kind of people who run these organizations, yes, it's no wonder. It's no wonder that they have these ideas is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, unfortunately, it's the way of the world.
You have another question here that asks, are you working on digitizing this library or is it to be purely physical?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Are you working on digitizing the Library of African Diaspora, or is it to be purely physical?
It's purely physical, but not because that's the way that we want it. We have had many discussions about digitizing part of the collection, but obviously there are copyright issues associated with that prevent us from doing so. However, a few years ago, we were lucky enough to receive a donation from a man called Professor Ian Munro, who is a professor of Caribbean and African literature in the United States. And he donated to us his whole collection, well, a sizable amount of his collection, which was about 2,000 plus rare and out of print books, mainly. So there is and not just books, actually. There's a lot of like pamphlets and radio scripts and, you know, various other products, or if you would call it that, cultural products like that, which we could digitize, actually. And it's just a process of having the resources in terms of the human resources and the time to be able to do that. But yes, it's something we're looking into.
Thanks for that. More questions are pouring in from the form as well as from, I'm going to read Onyinyechi's question. What is the best way to create a long-lasting career as a creative on the African continent? And how do you maintain your career? How does LOTAAD factor into that? Maybe this, it's a separate question from the other two.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that's a question for me, actually. I wish somebody else would answer that, especially the first part about what's the best way to create a long-lasting career, because I don't really feel like I'm a creative in that sense, and not on the African continent.
I would say, Onyinyechi, coming on the 28th, we have Uzoma and Ya speaking about this very specific question the entire time. Well, I guess the second part is more directed to you, Sylvia. How do you see LOTAAD factoring into creatives' careers or writers' careers on the continent?
Yeah, I think, you know, when I spoke in the beginning, you know, I said that we have kind of three pillars at LOTAAD, which is knowledge production, knowledge preservation, and knowledge dissemination. And in terms of the knowledge production work, I think that's really key for kind of developing and nurturing writers on the African continent in particular, and giving them, you know, I'm not even going to say time and space. I'm going to say giving them the skills and oh gosh, what's another word for space so I don't contradict myself? They're giving them the space to be able to focus on their work, which, you know, I'm pretty sure that most writers in Africa have a full-time job as well as being a writer. And in fact, most writers probably in the world, you know, whether they're teaching or they're doing something completely different, have a full-time job. So in terms of what we're able to do, it is to be able to say, forget your 9 to 5 and your daily pressures, whether you have a family, whether you have this, whether you have that, and come and immerse yourself in this literary radical environment for at least a month and focus on that. And, you know, I would kind of like say we have a pipeline effectively. It's like you come to the library, you focus on your work, and thank you, Akumbu, who said, you know, giving them a community as well. You come to the library, you focus on your work, you're with other people, which is the community, who are also in the same position as you or in a similar position as you, trying to either focus on a piece of work or develop their craft as a writer. You know, I would say it's invaluable. You know, somebody who's done residencies before, I have done residencies, but I've never done one in Africa, and I've never done one where the focus has been on African literature. So yeah, how does LOTAAD factor into that? I would say it's that. It's making people realize that being a writer on the continent is not just a dream, but it's also possible.
I think I'm also interested in hearing what you would say if we change that question to what's the best way to create a long-lasting career as a cultural worker? Because I like Chika, I actually think of you as a cultural worker.
Yeah. You know, I mentioned it in the presentation. I would say, you know, diversify what you do. If I think about all the things that we have done over the past 7 years, where we started simply as a library, like I said, it was just the books in the beginning. And then obviously we needed to get funding in various ways. And before we were able to get funding from outside, we had an Airbnb. So, you know, people could, and you didn't have to be a writer. You could obviously pay to come and stay in the library. Maybe you were visiting Ghana for the first time, or maybe you were visiting Accra for the first time, whatever. You could rent a room in the library. So that's one thing. The other thing that we did is something that's become a key part of our offering is the tours. We do guided tours of the library and the collection, and they last about 90 minutes. And I started to do this in 2020 when we moved into the second space, as a way to bring people in who were curious about literature, but maybe they didn't know that much. And it was such a success. But then we charge for that. And it's nothing big, you know, it's a token sum. So we've got the tours, we've got some merch, we do events, which we don't really charge for though. We now sell books. We had a store in the previous one and a little cafe. I think you really do have to kind of think outside of the box if you want to sustain yourself as a creative or a cultural worker, because unfortunately we all know, you know, how much does writing, even in the West, in America or wherever, you know, how much does writing really pay?
Yeah. I'm going to give Onyesha the floor. Her hand is up. Onyesha, feel free to mute yourself.
Hi everyone. Hi Sylvia. Hi Makulata. Yes, you actually did answer most of my question. I think yes. I think it was better to say cultural worker than creative, because I think I might be on the same path that you guys, the both of you are currently on. I just don't really know how to go about it, because I feel like I am a writer, but less of a writer and more of a cultural worker. And that's why I asked my first question, which is it is related to writing, but I did ask earlier on if LOATAD would be interested possibly in the future in doing a workshop that catered to editors, because I've realized that maybe I do want to facilitate a creative space for Africans in Africa and like people in Afro diasporans basically, but I don't know how to go about that. And I was just curious how one would do that and how one could possibly create a career with that, especially in the African continent. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I would agree with the kind of designation cultural worker as well.
Well, I feel like there was another question there, but I'm not sure. Sorry, because I kind of drifted off and I started. I'm guessing the conversation is over there. Sorry.
I actually have there's what, oh yeah. So I wanted to say that if anybody is interested about what it was like running the library and starting the library, I wrote a piece that was published on LitHub in 2019. And I think to me, it kind of sums up the feeling more than anything else, but the feeling and the reality of what it was like at that time. And so if anybody is interested, you can find it on LitHub, and it says a lot more than I have honestly been able to say today.
I think I was going to, the questions that started coming to my mind as I drifted off, I think this article will answer, but I started thinking of the personal, not costs per se, but like personal resources, like the emotional work, the inside spiritual even work that it takes to do something like this. Like you said earlier, I think it's been clear that this work is difficult, and not in like, okay, you're going against your own personal stream, but there are a lot of sacrifices to make. And this week in particular, I myself, Immaculata, I'm feeling very challenged, very tempted to be discouraged. And I wonder what well do you draw from in times when it feels like you're spending, you're sacrificing for something that is a sacrifice?
Yeah. Do you know what? That's a really difficult question, because I don't have an answer as such. And yeah, I really don't know, actually. It's just maybe it's a dogged perseverance. That's a natural part of my personality. I don't know. Because I also obviously have wanted to give up many times, and I've had opportunities to as well, especially like when the lease ran out on the first space. I was like, yeah, I'm not doing this again. This is my time to cut all ties. And then when the lease ran out on the second space, I was like, yeah, this is it. I'm not doing this again. I'm ready to walk away. And as I said in the talk, honestly, I feel there's no shame in quitting. I really don't. If I decided tomorrow, I don't want to do this anymore, and unfortunately, you know, obviously there's somebody, Seth, who I mentioned before, runs the library. If he said, you know, I don't want to do this anymore, I wouldn't feel any way or shame about quitting. I've done what I came to do. I've exceeded even probably what I came to do, and I've learned lots of things, and it's all good. And I hope other people have benefited from it as well. So I think you have to know what you can tolerate or what you're prepared to tolerate, and not be ashamed. Because I think, you know, shame is a big thing. You know, when one person turns up at your event, you're ashamed, or, you know, you feel bad about it. And you think, well, why am I even bothering? You know, I could have been at my nephew's, you know, whatever he was doing. You know, there's just so many things. But I think persevere for as long as you can and as long as you want to. And if it's not fun anymore, or if it's not serving you anymore, then there's no shame in quitting.
Yeah, because I think that shame is actually, it gets very strong because you feel like you're serving a duty. You're serving your community in a way that, you know, you might be letting someone down. But honestly, yeah.
Yeah, but, you know, you could also think that they're letting you down. Do you know what I mean? You've put all this in, and how are they engaging or interacting or appreciating, or, you know, I think it works both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me go through the questions from the group to see which ones are maybe relevant to you and I haven't brought up. In the meantime, okay, I think sometimes a vibrant social life may have to be sacrificed at times. This is from Chika. There's a time to do a lot of socializing and a time to hibernate, create, brood. Would love to hear others' view on this. My entire family disagrees, but I am of the same opinion. Sometimes it also doesn't feel like I have a choice. It's just, this is the work in front of me right now, and this is priority.
Definitely.
Key steps. Could you walk us through? You've done that. Decolonization practices for today's art practitioner. Are you interested in going there tonight? Cultural practitioner in this case.
Yeah. Do you know, I can't remember where, I think it was in Switzerland. I was having a conversation with a South African artist who's based there. And, you know, she said to me, oh, tell me about the library. And I said, it's a decolonized library. And she was like, no, I don't think you should use the term decolonized. I think it's more appropriate to use the term decolonizing. And I think she was spot on, actually. We can, well, not in my lifetime, probably, can never reach the point of probably being decolonized. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing, like, awareness and a consciousness that, you know, things have to change. And I feel no way about centering African literature and African writers and African diaspora writers whatsoever. But, you know, sometimes people who are not Black or African, for example, may come to the library and think, oh, there's something wrong here. There's something not quite right here, because they don't see names on the shelves that they would recognize. And that is part of the disruption. You know, that's part of the decolonizing. That's part of the radical nature of the space. And it's a necessary thing that needs to happen. And actually, when it's happening in, you would think anyway, you would think when it's happening in Africa, it's not decolonizing, or it's not decolonized, it's just existing, if you see what I mean. If you're in a Black country and you're surrounded by books by Black writers, isn't that the way things should be anyway? But actually, it's the total opposite. And when I used to do the tours, I used to like quote from this story that appeared in Granta, which was an obituary to Binyavanga Wainaina, the Kenyan writer. And it was I think it was a Nigerian writer actually, and he said that Binyavanga came to Nigeria, and he said to this writer, "Take me to the nearest library." And so he took him to, you know, whatever the library was, and I can't remember what part of Nigeria it was. And he said Binyavanga ran out of the library crying. So he ran out after him, and he said, you know, what's the matter? Why are you crying? And he said, this is the whitest library I've been to in my life. He said, where is Chimamanda? Where are my books? Where is Bettina Gappa's book? You know, where are all these writers' books? And, you know, I think one of the shocking things for people who are not living in Africa is when they come to Africa, seeing how colonized it is mentally in that way, if you see what I mean.
Real.
And so that's why when I say to people, oh, I have a library in Ghana and it's a Black library, it's actually a really radical thing.
Yeah.
Said it really is, because yeah, what can you say? I mean, you look at school curricula, you look at the books, and if they have any books in the libraries, and it's just not us.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions in this list that are specifically geared towards you. I also don't have any burning questions right now. I think you've covered a lot. Someone even just texted me saying they can't wait to rewatch because there's a lot to soak in. If anyone in the audience right now has any questions, comments, this is the one-time comments are actually allowed. Please feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, in the next like 2 minutes, I will give a closing statement. Okay, Uzoma has his hand. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Immaculata, and thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this comment is still sort of like forming. But I want to like offer my thinking soup to everyone. And I'm just turning over what you said about quitting, you know. Immaculata, what you said about like, you know, the journey getting really difficult. Yeah. And Sylvia, what you said about, you know, a freedom to quit as and when you feel the need to. I'm sitting with that, and I'm really wondering if you can actually ever really quit. And I think it's like thinking about this, you know, we're talking about thinking of ourselves as like cultural workers, you know, and I feel like a big part of that comes from it's like a deep conviction, you know, it's almost like a calling, you know, to do what you're doing, where you're doing it, when you're doing it, and in the way you're doing it. And I'm wondering if you can ever sort of like turn that off and like leave it. It feels to me like that calling manifests itself in different forms at different stages of your life or of your journey. And maybe it can look like you're quitting one manifestation of that calling at any point in time, but you're never actually quitting because you never really can, because the next thing is just going to be like another appropriation of like that overarching thing. So that's kind of what was going through my mind. It's like, almost for me, man, like, I don't know, can I actually ever leave this thing? Like, you know, the thing that like, almost like my why, like the thing that I'm trying to, and you just talking about Biavanga's like thing in the library, just kind of like spoke to that a little, with the library in Nigeria, spoke to that a little bit, because if that's the kind of problem you're trying to solve, you know, like a decolonial problem, man, you're in that for life. Like, yeah, it seems to me, you know. So yeah, that was what was going on through my head. And another thing I wanted to say earlier is that I really like the question about digitizing the library. I'm just like realizing how important that kind of work is for like our archives and our like cultural memory spaces, because I've been doing a lot of like collaborations that are in that direction, personally and like in my own work. So that's a conversation that I'll be very happy to have, because I think it's like very important work for an organization like LOTAAD or like any other spaces, even studio styles, anyone who's producing like cultural work. It needs to like be preserved. Yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the thing about the digitization, and I totally agree with you, but I would also say don't forget the physical artifact itself as well, because I remember I was listening to a radio interview the other day, or actually it was a workshop the other day, and there was a professor who was talking about having physical newspapers and physical books. And he was saying, you know, they said, why do you continue to keep physical stuff when everything now is digital? And he was like, well, when they turn the internet off, you know, I want to make sure I still have all my things here to prove that it existed. And I think that is a really important thing as well. So I think digitization, yes, it's key, but not to let that kind of take over or overtake, you know, the physical world of things. You know, we're still a physical people.
Oniche, please feel free to mute yourself, and thank you for that, Sylvia.
Yeah.
The question about digitization just made me, I just realized I had another question. So I've always been curious, like how, I mean, I know how libraries work, but I know because it's not just necessarily books as well, like there are other things and other artifacts that have to be preserved as well, and preservation is so important. And I understand like your reasoning for not digitizing as well.
Oh no,
I'm just curious.
It's not a reason for not digitizing. It's just saying that they go hand in hand.
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
that's what I should have said. Just based, sorry, not to go on and on, but how do you preserve, how do you basically preserve like physical like copies of like artifacts and books and everything, in, how do I phrase my question? In like an African library? Because sometimes I think about, I don't even know how I want to say this. Like, okay, because I'm from Nigeria, I live in Nigeria, and like I have my own things, like I have my laptop and my books, but like I don't know, like maybe in case of, I don't in case of like situations, like maybe economic situations or like financial situations or something like terrible happening, how do you preserve that in that setting or that environment?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that point.
That's a really good question, because obviously in an African context, we have all kinds of environmental issues to contend with when you're thinking about paper products in particular. There's obviously the heat and the humidity, there's insects, there's other creatures as well. I once had a whole box of books like eaten by mice. So there are all those kind of things that you have to take into consideration, but they obviously cost a lot of money to do. And it's not just books as well. We also have ephemera. So we have letters, for example, from, you know, various writers. There's one from Nawal El-Saadawi that I have in my own collection. We have like signed Kwame Nkrumah, for example. All these things require serious looking after and preservation. And we're lucky enough that we're working with an archive team from the UK, which is headed up by Dr. Etienne Joseph and Lydia, and there's a team of about 4 or 5 of them. And they come to Ghana, they came last year or the year before, and they've helped us to package and to preserve some of the most important books and pamphlets and ephemera. But obviously, I'm not an archiving expert, they are. It's a costly and it's a long-term process that we're engaged in with them. But it's definitely a massive, massive consideration, especially in Africa. And it's one that requires a lot of financial resources.
Thank you.
Air conditioning is another one, you know, to keep the temperature and, you know, all kinds of things.
Exactly. Thank you for understanding what I was trying to ask. Because I was thinking about that in, you phrased it a lot better than I did, in an African context. And I feel like with the thing you said earlier, I feel like with the way everything is here, people would just assume that you would want to strictly digitize everything. And like there really isn't a need for that.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, you can even put it in the context of the Benin bronzes, for example. You know, how would you feel if, I mean, they're nonsense anyway. All these people are nonsense. So I'll just say that up front. But, you know, if they said, oh, we'll give you a digital version of, you know, this Benin artifact, obviously it's not good enough. You don't want the digital version. You want the physical thing back. Give us our stuff back. So I think digital has its place, but I don't think that replaces the physical at all. To me, like one of the main purposes of digital, yes, it's preservation, but it's also broadening access as well. But it doesn't replace the physical object.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
If Fazwila, yeah, okay. Please unmute yourself.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
This is just a comment in response to what was said earlier. You mentioned that you had started out as a limited company or private company.
Yes.
And my question is obviously on the diversifying of cultural institutions and the dangers around commercializing cultural institutions and arts institutions themselves. When we are saying that we are decolonizing, would that not mean also that we are almost moving away from capitalist notions of business interactions and institutions and profit making almost?
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Thanks. You know, I think in theory, I see where you're coming from, but I think the reality is that we have to keep the lights on. We have to pay for staff. We have to buy books, which is very important to keep the collection updated, and all these other things. And, you know, unfortunately, we live in the system that we live in. And so whilst you can, and most people do, and most organizations do operate as nonprofits, and, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, I still think that even within the framework of being a nonprofit, you can still diversify your revenue streams. And whether that, you know, like I've mentioned before, I mean, you know, we do all kinds of things. And actually, I should say that in the beginning, we used to charge people to be members of the library, because we used to allow them to take books, to borrow books and take them home. And, you know, a classic example was when Michelle Obama's Becoming came out in 2021 or whenever it was. We used to charge people 50 Ghana cedis to borrow 2 books and to be a member of the library. So they would come and they would sign up and become a member of the library, pay the 50 cedis. They would borrow like the Michelle Obama Becoming book and another book, and then you would never see them again. And let me tell you, when the Michelle Obama book came out, it was selling for like 300 Ghana cedis. So basically they've paid 50 cedis because they see it as, you know, they saw it as a way to get the books in an even cheaper fashion. You have to consider all these things when you're thinking about how you operate and how you set up and how you register yourself, because these are all real issues, unfortunately. And whilst I do agree that we do not necessarily have to follow existing paradigms for how we operate, I also think we have to work in the reality of the situation that we're in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And the response is the thing I grapple with the most every day. Like at least an hour of my cumulative time a day is spent asking, how do we balance? It's not even a question of balance. It's a question of like your theory matching your practice. Terry Wama, I was wondering if you could ask your question out loud if you're still on the call. Her question, okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you. I was just wondering, this is obviously a collaboration between 2 different platforms, and I was just wondering overall, how does the process of collaborating with similar organizations work, especially if they're located in different African countries, and how does that affect how much funding you're able to get? Are there any grants you've applied for that have been easier to to get because you collaborated with a different organization, or does that not necessarily impact that space at all?
From my perspective, it's very difficult. And, you know, I was asked this question again in Switzerland a few years ago. It's very difficult to collaborate with other African organizations, and it's much easier to collaborate with organizations that are based in the United States or Europe. And I think one of the reasons for that is, first of all, we are not very connected. And I'm talking about logistically, geographically, we're not that connected within Africa, unfortunately. And second of all, I think that from a funding perspective, it's easier to get funding to collaborate with another organization based in, you know, the UK or in America or whatever. So for example, I know lots of British Council funding is for you, like, collaborating with an organization based in the UK, and you can be based in Ghana or you can be based in Nigeria, you know, wherever, but you have to collaborate with a UK organization. And I guess that's one way that they think that they're getting some kind of accountability. And it's a way of them, you know, they think funding an African organization while not really funding the African organization directly. So yeah, I've actually found it much more difficult to collaborate with other African institutions than I have with, you know, for example, somebody in Switzerland or some organization in Switzerland or in the UK or wherever.
Oh, wow. Thank you for the answer. But that, yeah, that's actually really sad that we're not able to collaborate as much on the continent.
Yeah, I mean, even like when I think about the West African Writers Residency, for example, which, you know, as the name implies, was restricted to the region of West Africa, to the 16 countries of West Africa. And what was so beautiful about that residency in particular was that you would have somebody from the Gambia, for example, meeting somebody for the first time from Liberia, for example, meeting somebody for the first time from Nigeria, for example. And I think it highlighted how little we know about each other as an African peoples. And, you know, sometimes you could listen to conversations between people and, you know, you would hear all this stuff about American politics, about European politics, but you ask them, you know, who's the president of Chad, for example, and nobody could tell you. So unfortunately, yes, I think it's, without wanting to be, you know, conspiracy theorist about it, I do think it's part of the whole way of containing us and containing African peoples.
Yes, I definitely agree with that, unfortunately, yeah.
And actually, like another thing, sorry, that I'll bring up from that West African Writers Residency is, with that residency, we used to cover the travel of the writers who were selected. And, you know, I can tell you that it was cheaper to buy a ticket for somebody to fly from, and this is not for West African, but for another residency, from the UK to Ghana than it was from Abuja to Accra. And yeah, wow. It's just, we are not connected, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very, like, it's wild when you start seeing the reality. Like, you know, this in theory that we don't know. Like me, that's living next to Togo. I don't even know, is it Togo or Benin that is actually beside Nigeria? I don't know. Yeah, it's actually crazy. So Tope Ajay is asking, can they get your email address? Is it possible to get your email address?
I think it's even on this slide here. Let me just see if I can find it. There.
Yeah. info@LOTAAD.org. LOATAD.org. Okay. I know I said I'm down to yap, but I'm actually getting sleepy.
And my throat is getting dry.
So thank you everyone for joining. This has been such a pleasure. Like, I love all the questions. They were all the questions I had as well. And even the questions I didn't even know to have. You guys brought it. And I'm very grateful to all of you that have stayed till the very end of the call. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Like,
thank you too.
Thank you.